Welcome to the video lecture for Unit 4, Module 8.2. In this one, we're going to discuss some of the renal physiology and glomerular filtration. As always, here are your learning objectives. Be sure to reference these when studying for both your lecture quiz and the unit exam. And let's go ahead and jump into this one. So most people don't commonly think of it this way, but the goal of urine production is to maintain homeostasis by regulating the volume and the composition of blood. This process involves the excretion of solutes, specifically metabolic wastes. Our bodies form three important organic wastes. 1. Urea. Urea is the most abundant organic waste. You generate approximately 21 grams of urea each day, most of it through the breakdown of amino acids. 2 is creatinine. Skeletal muscle tissues generate creatinine through the breakdown of creatine phosphate, a high-energy compound that plays an important role in muscle contraction. Your body generates roughly 1.8 grams of creatinine each day. Virtually all of it is excreted in the urine. And 3 is uric acid. Uric acid is a waste formed during the recycling of nitrogenous bases from RNA molecules. You produce approximately 480 milligrams of uric acid each day. These wastes are dissolved in the bloodstream. They can be eliminated only when dissolved in urine. For this reason, their removal involves an unavoidable water loss. The kidneys are usually capable of producing concentrated urine within an osmotic concentration of 1,200 to 1,400 milliosmoles per liter, more than 4 times that of plasma. And we'll discuss methods of reporting solute concentrations in a later section. If the kidneys were unable to concentrate the filtrate produced by glomerular filtration, fluid losses would lead to fatal dehydration in a matter of hours. The kidneys also ensure that the fluid that is lost does not contain potentially useful organic substrates that are present in blood plasma, such as sugars or amino acids. These valuable materials must be reabsorbed and retained for use by other tissues. In forming urine, the kidneys use 3 distinct processes that we've already mentioned. 1 is filtration. In filtration, blood pressure forces water and solutes across the wall of the glomerular capillaries and into the capsular space. Solute molecules are small enough to pass through the filtration membrane, are carried by the surrounding water molecules. 2 is reabsorption. Reabsorption is the removal of water and solutes from the filtrate and their movement across the tubular epithelium and into the peritubular fluid. Reabsorption takes place after the filtrate has left the renal corpuscle. Most of the reabsorbed materials are nutrients that the body can use. Filtration is based solely on size, but reabsorption is a selective process. Reabsorption involves either simple diffusion or the activity of the carrier proteins in the tubular epithelium. The reabsorbed substance in the peritubular fluid eventually reenters the blood. Water reabsorption takes place passively through osmosis. 3 is secretion. Secretion is the transport of solutes from the peritubular fluid across the tubular epithelium and into the tubular fluid. Secretion is necessary because filtration does not force all the dissolved materials out of the plasma. Tubular secretion, which removes substances from the blood, can further lower the plasma concentration of undesirable materials. It provides a backup process for filtration. Secretion is often the primary method of preparing substances, including many drugs, for excretion. Together, these processes produce a fluid that is very different from other body fluids. Table 26-2, which you can see here, shows the efficiency of the renal system by comparing the concentrations of some substances in urine and plasma. Most regions carry out a combination of reabsorption and secretion. Note that the balance between the two processes shifts from one region to another. Normal kidney function can continue only as long as filtration, reabsorption, and secretion function within relatively narrow limits. A disruption in kidney function has immediate effects on the composition of the circulating blood. If both kidneys are affected, death follows within a few days unless medical assistance is provided. So before we take a closer look at the functions of the individual portions of the nephron, let's briefly examine each of the 3 major processes involved in urine formation. In filtration, hydrostatic pressures force water through membrane pores, and solute molecules small enough to pass through these pores are carried along. Filtration takes place as larger solutes and suspended materials are left behind. We can see filtration in action in a drip coffee machine. Gravity forces hot water through the filter, and the water carries a variety of dissolved compounds into the pot. The large coffee grounds never reach the pot because they cannot fit through the pores of the filter. In other words, they are filtered out of solution. The coffee we drink is the filtrate. In the body, the heart pushes blood around the cardiovascular system and generates hydrostatic pressure. As you've seen, filtration takes place across the walls of the capillary as water and dissolved materials are pushed into the interstitial fluids of the body. In some sites, for example in the liver, the pores are so large that even plasma proteins can enter the interstitial fluid. At the renal corpuscle, however, the specialized filtration membrane restricts the passage of even the smallest circulating proteins. The processes of reabsorption and secretion by the kidneys involve a combination of diffusion, osmosis, channel-mediated diffusion, and carrier-mediated transport. We've considered diffusion and osmosis in several other molecules, so it should be a relatively ingrained concept at this point. But here, we'll briefly review carrier-mediated transport mechanisms. In previous modules, we've also looked at 4 major types of carrier-mediated transport, especially in 168. In facilitated diffusion, a carrier protein transports a molecule across the plasma membrane without expanding energy. Such transport always follows the concentration gradient for the ion or molecule transported. Active transport is driven by the hydrolysis of ATP to ADP on the inner plasma membrane surface. Exchange pumps and other carrier-mediated proteins are active along the kidney tubules. Active transport can operate despite an opposing concentration gradient. In cotransport, carrier protein activity is not directly linked to the hydrolysis of ATP. Instead, 2 substrates, ions, molecules, or both, cross the membrane while bound to the carrier protein. The movement of the substrates always follows the concentration gradient of at least one of the transported substances. Cotransport is used for the reabsorption of organic and inorganic compounds from the tubular fluid. Countertransport resembles cotransport, except that the 2 transported ions move in opposite directions. Countertransport operates in the PCT, the DCT, and the collecting system. All carrier-mediated processes share 5 features that are important for an understanding of kidney function. 1. A specific substrate binds to a carrier protein that facilitates movement across the membrane. The movement may be active or passive. 2. A given carrier protein typically works only in one direction. In facilitated diffusion, the concentration gradient of the substance that's being transported determines that direction. In active transport, cotransport, and countertransport, the location and orientation of the carrier proteins determine whether a particular substance is reabsorbed or secreted. The carrier protein that transports amino acids from the tubular fluid to the cytosol, for example, will not carry amino acids back into the tubular fluid. 3. The distribution of carrier proteins can vary among portions of the cell surface. Transport between tubular fluid and interstitial, or the peritubular fluid, involves 2 steps. First, the materials must enter the cell at its apical surface. Then the material leaves the cell as its basolateral surface and enters the peritubular fluid. Each step involves a different carrier protein. For example, the apical surfaces along the proximal convoluted tubule contain carrier proteins that bring amino acids, glucose, and many other nutrients into these cells by sodium-linked cotransport. In contrast, the basolateral surfaces contain carrier proteins that move those nutrients out of the cell by facilitated diffusion. 4. The membrane of a single tubular cell contains many types of carrier proteins. Each cell can have multiple functions. A cell that reabsorbs one compound can secrete another. And 5. Carrier proteins, like enzymes, can be saturated. Recall that when an enzyme is saturated, further increases in substrate concentration have no effect on the rate of reaction. Likewise, when a carrier protein is saturated, further increases in substrate concentration have no effect on the ratio of the transport across the membrane. For any substance, the concentration at saturation is called the transport maximum, or T sub m, or tubular maximum. In healthy people, carrier proteins involved in tubular secretion seldom become saturated. However, carriers involved in tubular reabsorption are often at risk of saturation, especially during the absorptive states that follow a meal. Normally, any plasma proteins and nutrients, such as amino acids and glucose, are removed through the tubular fluid by cotransport or facilitated diffusion. If the concentrations of these nutrients rise in the tubular fluid, the rate of reabsorption increases until the carrier proteins are saturated. A concentration higher than the transport maximum exceeds the reabsorptive abilities of the nephron. In this case, some of the material will remain in the tubular fluid and appear in the urine. The transport maximum thus determines the renal threshold, the plasma concentration at which a specific substance or an ion begins to appear in the urine. The renal threshold varies with the substance involved. The renal threshold for glucose is approximately 180 milligrams per deciliter. When plasma glucose concentrations exceed that 180 milligrams per deciliter, glucose appears in the urine. This condition is called glycosuria or glucosuria. If you've ever eaten a meal rich in carbohydrates, your plasma glucose levels may exceed the TM for a brief time. The liver quickly lowers circulating glucose levels, and very little glucose is lost in your urine. However, chronically increased plasma and urinary glucose concentrations are abnormal. Glycosuria is one of the key signs of diabetes mellitus. The renal threshold for amino acid is lower than that for glucose. Amino acids appear in the urine when plasma concentrations exceed 65 milligrams per deciliter. Plasma amino acid levels commonly exceed the renal threshold after you've eaten a protein-rich meal, causing some amino acids to appear in your urine. This condition is called amino aciduria. TM values for water-soluble vitamins are relatively low. As a result, you excrete excess quantities of these vitamins in urine. This is typically the fate of water-soluble vitamins and dietary supplements. Cells of the renal tubule ignore a number of other substances in the tubular fluid. As water and other substances are removed, the concentrations of ignored materials in the tubular fluid gradually rise. Table 26-3 that you see here lists some substances that are actively reabsorbed or secreted by the renal tubules, as well as several that are not transported at all. The osmotic concentration, or osmolarity, of a solution is the total number of solute particles in each liter. We usually express osmolarity in osmoles per liter, or milliosmoles per liter. If each liter of a fluid contains 1 mole dissolved particles, the solute concentration is 1 osmole per liter, or 1,000 milliosmoles per liter. Body fluids have an osmotic concentration of about 300 milliosmoles per liter. For comparison, seawater is about 1,000 milliosmoles per liter, and freshwater is about 5 milliosmoles per liter. In a clinical setting, the osmolarity of urine is often reported as osmolality, expressed as milliosmoles per kilogram of water. When discussing osmotic concentrations in body fluids, these terms are often used interchangeably. Ion concentrations are often reported in milliequivalents per liter. Milliequivalents indicate the number of positive or negative charges in solution rather than the number of solute particles. Multiply milliosmoles per liter by the charges on each ion to convert milliequivalents. For example, each sodium ion has 1 charge only, so for Na+, 1 milliosmole per liter equals 1 milliequivalent per liter. For calcium 2+, or Ca2+, each ion has 2 charges, so 1 milliosmole per liter is equal to 2 milliequivalents per liter. The concentrations of large organic molecules are usually reported in grams, milligrams, or micrograms per unit volume of solution, typically per deciliter. In the next sections, we'll proceed along the nephron to consider the formation of filtrate and its subsequent changes in composition and concentration as it passes along the renal tubule. Most of what follows applies equally to cortical and juxtamedullary nephrons. The functions of each renal corpuscle and the proximal and distal convoluted tubules are the same in all nephrons. The major difference between the two types of nephron is that the nephron loop of a cortical nephron is shorter. Note that it does not extend as far into the medulla as the nephron loop of a juxtamedullary nephron. The long nephron loop in a juxtamedullary nephron extends deep into the renal pyramids. There it plays a key role in water conservation and the formation of concentrated urine. This process is vitally important, affecting the tubular fluid produced by every nephron in the kidney. For this reason, we use a juxtamedullary nephron as our example. Table 26-4 summarizes the functions of the various parts of that nephron. Filtration takes place in the renal corpuscle as fluids move across the wall of the glomerulus and into the capsular space. The process of glomerular filtration involves a passage across the filtration membrane. Recall that this membrane has 3 components: 1, the capillary endothelium; 2, the dense layer; and 3, the filtration slits. Glomerular capillaries are fenestrated capillaries with pores ranging from 60 to 100 nanometers in diameter. These openings are small enough to prevent the passage of blood cells, but they are too large to restrict the diffusion of solutes, even those the size of plasma proteins. The dense layer is more selective. Only small plasma proteins, nutrients, and ions can cross it. The filtration slits are the finest filters of all. Their gaps are only about 6 to 9 nanometers wide. These gaps are small enough to prevent the passage of most small plasma proteins. As a result, under normal circumstances, only a few plasma proteins, such as albumin molecules with an average diameter of about 7 nanometers, can cross the filtration membrane and enter the capsular space. However, plasma proteins are all that stay behind, so the filtrate contains dissolved ions and small organic molecules in roughly the same concentrations as the plasma. The primary factor involved in glomerular filtration is basically the same as one that regulates fluid and solute movement across capillaries throughout the body. This factor is the balance between the hydrostatic pressure, or the fluid pressure, and the colloid osmotic pressure, or the pressure due to the materials in solution, on either side of the capillary walls. Blood pressure is low in typical systemic capillaries. The reason is that capillary blood flows into the venous system, where resistance is fairly low. However, at the glomerulus, blood leaving the glomerular capillaries flows into an efferent arteriole, whose diameter is smaller than that of the afferent arteriole. For this reason, the efferent arteriole offers considerable resistance. Relatively high pressures are needed to force blood into it. As a result, glomerular pressures are similar to those of smaller arteries. These pressures average about 50 instead of the typical 35 of peripheral capillaries. Capsular hydrostatic pressure, or CSHP, opposes the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. This pressure results from the resistance to flow along the nephron and the conducting system. Before any filtrate can enter the capsule, some of the filtrate already present must be forced into the PCT. The CSHP averages about 15. The net hydrostatic pressure, or the NHP, is the difference between the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which tends to push water and solutes out of the bloodstream, and the capsular hydrostatic pressure, which tends to push water and solutes into the bloodstream. We can calculate the net hydrostatic pressure as follows. NHP is equal to GHP minus CHP, which is also equal to 50 minus 15, or equal to 35. The colloid osmotic pressure of a solution is the osmotic pressure resulting from suspended proteins. Under normal conditions, very few plasma proteins enter the capsular space, so no opposing colloid osmotic pressure exists within the capsule. However, if the glomeruli are damaged by disease or injury, and plasma proteins begin passing into the capsular space, a capsular colloid osmotic pressure is created that promotes filtration and increases fluid losses in urine. The net filtration pressure, or the NFP, at the glomerulus is the difference between the net hydrostatic pressure and the blood colloid osmotic pressure acting across the glomerular capillaries. Under normal circumstances, we can summarize this relationship as NFP is equal to NHP minus BCOP. This is the average pressure forcing water and dissolved materials out of the glomerular capillaries and into the capsular spaces. Problems that affect net filtration pressure can seriously disrupt kidney function and cause a variety of clinical signs and symptoms. The glomerular filtration rate, or the GFR, is the amount of filtrate that the kidneys produce each minute. Each kidney contains about 6 square meters, or some 64 square feet, of filtration surface, and the GFR averages an astounding 125 milliliters per minute. This means that nearly 10% of the fluid delivered to the kidneys by renal arteries leaves the bloodstream and enters the capsular spaces. A creatinine clearance test is often used to estimate the GFR. Creatinine results from the breakdown of creatine phosphate in the muscle tissue and is normally eliminated in the urine. Creatinine enters the filtrate at the glomerulus and is not reabsorbed in significant amounts. By monitoring the creatinine concentrations in blood and the amount excreted in urine in a 24-hour period, a clinician can easily estimate the GFR. Consider, for example, a person who eliminates 84 milligrams of creatinine each hour and has a plasma creatinine concentration of 1.4 milliliters per deciliter. The GFR is equal to the amount of secretion divided by the plasma concentration. So this person's GSR is 84 divided by 1.4, which is equal to 60 deciliters per hour, or 100 milliliters per minute. The GFR is usually reported in milliliters per minute. The value 100 milliliters per minute is only an approximation of the GFR. The reason is that up to 15% of creatinine in the urine enters by means of active tubular secretion. When necessary, a more accurate GFR can be obtained by using the complex carbohydrate inulin. The compound is not metabolized in the body and is neither reabsorbed nor secreted by the kidney tubules. In the course of a single day, the glomeruli generate about 180 liters of filtrate, approximately 70 times the total of the plasma volume. But as filtrate passes through the renal tubules, about 99% of it is reabsorbed. So you should now appreciate the significance of tubular reabsorption. The glomerular filtration rate depends on the net filtration pressure across the glomerular capillaries. Any factors that alter the net filtration pressure alters the GFR and affects kidney function. One of the most significant factors is a decrease in renal blood pressure. If blood pressure at the glomeruli decreases by 20%, say from 50 to 40, kidney filtration ceases because the net filtration pressure is zero. For this reason, kidneys are sensitive to changes in blood pressure that have little or no effect on other organs. Hemorrhaging, shock, and dehydration are relatively common clinical conditions that can cause a dangerous decrease in the GFR and lead to acute renal failure. Glomerular filtration is the vital first step for all other kidney functions. If filtration does not take place, waste products are not excreted, pH control is jeopardized, and an important mechanism for regulating blood volume is lost. It should be no surprise that a variety of regulatory mechanisms ensure that the GFR remains within its normal limits. Filtration depends on adequate blood flow to the glomerulus and maintenance of normal filtration pressures. 3 interacting levels of control stabilize GFR. 1. Autoregulation at the local level, 2. Hormonal regulation initiated by the kidneys, and 3. Autonomic regulation, primarily by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Autoregulation, or local blood flow regulation, maintains adequate GFR despite changes in local blood pressures and blood flow. Myogenic mechanisms, or how arteries and arterioles react to an increase or decrease in blood pressure, play a role in the autoregulation of blood flow. Changes to the diameters of efferent arterioles, and glomerular capillaries maintain the GFR. The most important regulatory mechanisms stabilize the GFR when systemic blood pressure drops. The GFR also remains relatively constant when the systemic blood pressures increase. An increase in renal blood pressure stretches the walls of the afferent arterioles, and the smooth muscle cells respond by contracting. The reduction in diameter of afferent arterioles decreases glomerular blood flow and keeps the GFR within normal limits. The GFR is regulated by hormones of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and the natriuretic peptides, ANP and BNP. There are 3 triggers for the release of renin by the juxtaglomerular complex. They are 1. A decrease in blood pressure at the glomerulus as a result of a decrease in blood volume, a decrease in systemic pressures, or a blockage in the renal artery or its branches. 2. Stimulation of the juxtaglomerular cells by sympathetic innervation, or 3. A decrease in the osmotic concentration of the tubular fluid at the macula densa. These triggers are often interrelated. For example, a decrease in systemic blood pressures reduces the glomerular filtration rate, while the baroreceptor reflexes cause a sympathetic activation. Meanwhile, a decrease in the GFR slows the movement of tubular fluid along the nephron. As a result, the tubular fluid is in the aciny limb of the nephron loop longer, and the concentration of sodium and chloride ions in the tubular fluid reaching the macula densa and the DCT becomes abnormally low. A decrease in GFR leads to the release of renin by the juxtaglomerular complex. Renin converts the inactive protein angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is also inactive, but is then converted to angiotensin 2 by the angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. This conversion takes place primarily in the capillaries of the lungs. Angiotensin 2 acts at the nephron, adrenal glands, and the CNS. In peripheral capillary beds, angiotensin 2 causes a brief but powerful vasoconstriction of arterioles and precapillary sphincters, increasing the arterial pressures through the body. The combined effect is an increase in systemic blood volume and blood pressure and the restoration of normal GFR. If blood volume increases, the GFR increases automatically. This increase promotes fluid losses that can help return blood volume to normal levels. If the increase in blood volume is severe, hormonal factors further increase the GFR and speed up fluid losses in the urine. The heart releases natriuretic peptides when increased blood volume or blood pressure stretches the walls of the heart. The atria release atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, and the ventricles release brain natriuretic peptide, or BNP. Among their other effects, these hormones trigger the dilation of the afferent arterioles and the constriction of efferent arterioles. This mechanism increases glomerular pressures and increases the GFR. The natriuretic peptides also decrease sodium reabsorption at the renal tubules. The net result is increased urine production and decreased blood volume and pressure. Most of the autonomic innervation of the kidneys consists of sympathetic postganglionic fibers. The role of a few parasympathetic fibers in regulating the kidney function is not known. Sympathetic activation has a direct effect on the GFR. It produces a powerful vasoconstriction of afferent arterioles, which decreases the GFR and slows the production of filtrate. In this way, the sympathetic activation triggered by an acute decrease in blood pressure or heart attack overrides the local regulatory mechanisms that act to stabilize the GFR. As the crisis passes and sympathetic tone decreases, the filtration rate gradually returns to normal. When the sympathetic division alters regional patterns of blood circulation, blood flow to the kidneys is often affected. For example, the dilation of superficial vessels in warm weather shunts blood away from the kidneys. As a result, glomerular filtration decreases temporarily. The effect becomes especially pronounced during strenuous exercise. As blood flow to your skin and skeletal muscles increases, kidney perfusion gradually decreases. The changes may be opposed with variable success by autoregulation at the local level. At maximal levels of exertion, renal blood flow may be less than 25% of normal resting levels. This reduction can create problems for endurance athletes. Metabolic waste buildup over the course of a long event. Proteinuria, or protein that's in the urine, commonly occurs after such events because the glomerular cells have been injured by prolonged hypoxia, or low oxygen levels. If the damage is substantial, hematuria, or blood in the urine, occurs. Hematuria develops in about 18% of marathon runners. The cause is trauma to the bladder epithelium from the shock of running. proteinuria, and hematuria generally disappear within 48 hours as the glomerular tissues are repaired. However, a small number of marathon and ultramarathon runners experience acute renal failure with permanent impairment of kidney function.